resilient, and hopeful about the future.
I believe that self-care is one of the single most important things that you can do for yourself. I'm teaching my children not only to love themselves and to embrace themselves, but also to take time out to find the things that make them happy, make them love, and to make them feel free every single day.
Today and every day, the Black Women's Health Imperative celebrates our diversity, our beauty, our magic, our confidence, our joy, our love of life, our love for family, and our love for each other. May we all be Black and well for generations to come.
Welcome back to another episode of Black and Well TV. I'm Linda Goler-Blount, President and CEO of the Black Women's Health Imperative. If you're new to Black and Well TV, our show was created to be an interactive experience. So please ask any questions you have throughout the entire broadcast using the chat area. And if we can't get to them during the show, we'll answer them afterwards. The disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and Brown people and the injustices in policing have, for some, been a clarion call to show support for friends and coworkers. But what does that mean? And how do they do it? Today, Juneteenth, when we commemorate the end of legalized enslavement, we will explore what it means to have allies and how we need to establish lasting and meaningful relationships to achieve justice and equity. Our guests today have each been active in sharing their points of view and in ways that have gone viral. I'm excited to have them on the show to give us some perspective and offer their thoughts on how to have these very crucial conversations. So let's get started. Our first guest is Amber Cabral. Amber is an inclusion strategist, certified coach, writer, and speaker, formerly a diversity strategist at Walmart stores, and she founded Cabral Company, a consulting firm to help organizations create inclusive cultures. And I just have to say this because I just heard it. Prior to this webinar, she spoke to 7,000 people on diversity and inclusion and other topics. So we're really happy to have you here. Glad you could fit us in.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So some 60 years ago, Dinah Washington sang a song, "What a Difference a Day Makes." Mm-hmm. 4 days ago, the Supreme Court ruled in a rather unexpected way. More than 200 major corporations filed a brief supporting gay and transgender employees. Can you talk a little bit about the ruling and what it says about how far the gay rights movement has come and maybe how far it still has to go?
Yeah, the thing about this work that's really important to keep in mind is that it's always going to be moving. There's always going to be a new target. There's always going to be something else that we want to focus on and try to get to. And so this says it's a huge awakening happening. We're in an awakening period around a lot of topics. And I feel like if you think about what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, it's to align with the times, what's happening in the times. And so even though there may be some conservative judges, and we all definitely had our reservations about what that might look like, I think what has happened is that they're leaning on the responsibility that they have to the times. And so it's not just the work that's been done, it's the impact of that work and the Supreme Court recognizing their role in seeing it. And so, yeah, I think it's a great win. It's a huge step forward, but there's always going to be another target to aim for.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen Supreme Court rulings, and then it's about what happens after that.
Right.
So just because this happened doesn't mean we're done. What would you like to see next?
Well, honestly, I'm so surprised by the last two rulings that have come out of the Supreme Court. I'm just a little shook about what the next step should be, but I definitely think that there needs to be more consideration around equity, and not for any specific group, but like equity as a whole. Like, we already know there are power dynamics that are imbalanced in this country. Access is imbalanced in this country. And so, if you just take your identity, whatever that may be, and you layer on any piece of intersectionality, but especially Black, there's an opportunity there for a case to arise. There's an opportunity there where, the Supreme Court may need to weigh in to create, access, whatever it is, whatever the controversial topic is. And so what I think I'd like to see is more bravery from our justices, in leaning in and saying, okay, let's pay attention to what's happening with the times and consider that in the levity of the impact that we can make by making the smart decisions now, so that when we, as we inch forward, we will still have things, society changes and evolves, but those things will be less painful in terms of impact and less restrictive in terms of the way that they're, showing up in people's lives.
So both my kids recently have been asked to help their bosses or companies sort of understand and engage coworkers as a result of the protests, in particular following George Floyd's murder by Minneapolis policemen. Recently, you had an article in Fast Company, and you wrote about not being the Black spokesperson, which is a position probably many people watching right now have found themselves in. Could you share a little bit about how this could be handled as a Black employee, particularly one who's not an expert in diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think the big thing is that people should realize that first, right? Like, just because someone is Black doesn't make them an inclusion and diversity expert. It also doesn't mean that they want to be the person that people look to. And so it's a failure of consideration on the part of the asker, first of all. But you're right. There are a lot of people that are being put in this position to have to try to answer for like your identity. I am the Black woman in the room. So now I speak for all women that are Black, and if I'm the only Black person, then I'm being put in the position to speak for all Black people. Honestly, the thing is, you just have to have language ready. And so I always tell people, hey, I'm happy to share my perspective, but I want you to be clear that it's my perspective and I don't speak for our entire culture. So we want to get some additional access. We may need to take some additional steps, and I'm happy to share with you what I think, but I'm not going to speak for everyone. So I would appreciate you not putting that weight on my shoulders. And a lot of times what will happen is the person who's doing the asking will kind of, oh, no, I wasn't trying to say that. Well, I mean, it doesn't matter, whether you were trying to say it or not. The thing that's the most important is that you're hearing from my mouth to your ears that the way I'd like to be treated is that you consider me in the fullness of my identity, and not just because I have this thing that doesn't show up in this space outside of me. And so it's having the language to say just exactly that. And then, another tactic you can use is to just ask a question. Oh, what made you ask me that? Why did you choose to ask me? And then sometimes what'll happen is people will kind of catch themselves. Like they'll realize like, oh, I'm talking to the only Black person here. And so I probably shouldn't do it this way. And they'll adjust. And so, yeah, I mean, those are the two main tips I give people in terms of just kind of like surviving that kind of confrontation with someone who's, they're well-meaning, but it's still really interrupting, your life with something you don't want to have to carry.
Yeah, the thing that concerns me is if it's a coworker, that's one thing. If it's your boss or your boss's boss's boss, it's something else, because now you've got a power dynamic. Right. And employees might feel uncomfortable saying, look, you shouldn't ask me to do this. Yeah. And might feel pressure to do it. So what can you offer people by way of sort of meeting the request without having to take on that full responsibility of speaking for all Black people and brown people?
Yeah. Again, I think the best way is to kind of underscore, this is my opinion. So I think you should also seek out additional diverse opinions. I definitely understand the feeling of not wanting to push back on your leader. Thankfully, we are moving into workplaces that understand that that's necessary in some cases. But absolutely, if you're not in a safe workspace, you don't have that psychological safety where you can say, listen, I don't speak for all Black people. I'm uncomfortable answering this way. Frame it so that I encourage you to find some additional perspectives outside of just mine. So that way people will at least, have that light bulb moment where it's like, oh, that's something else I can do. But otherwise, you're kind of limited if you're not safe in your job. And a lot of people are struggling with that. Question asking is really good. You can always kind of, just those really light questions like, can you say more about that? Just stuff like that kind of pushes people to rethink what they're inquiring, and they'll kind of find their way back to like that politically correct, neutral and appropriate engagement space.
So now with the Supreme Court ruling, there's perhaps another consideration that gay employees, transgender employees might also be put in the same position.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, what do you think about that Supreme Court ruling? And then suddenly have to speak for all gay people. But that could be a little more fraught.
Mm-hmm.
So what I imagine some of the suggestions are the same, but it's a little bit different. So what would you say to employees or colleagues who find themselves in that situation?
Yeah, being asked the question and put on the spot is tough. I usually try to approach the leadership. So I do a lot of leadership training. And so I typically try to highlight these exact examples to my clients. Like, these are the things that you are doing that you think are helpful. You think you're inviting conversation. You think you're helping someone along. But in reality, what you're doing is putting someone on the spot. And so if you are a person that is put on the spot, you can always say, oh, I really don't know about that. I don't really feel comfortable talking about it. I'm not sure. If you're just not comfortable pushing back, because a lot of times, like you said, it's a leader and you're like, I don't want to have this discussion with you. So you can always kind of escape that way with just a light, yeah, I'm not really sure. I know that I can speak confidently about that. If it's someone that's a peer or a colleague or someone that you feel comfortable holding accountable, then you should definitely push back and say, well, what made you ask me that? Why'd you ask me? Again, give people those nuggets so that they can catch their own behavior. You don't have to necessarily call it out, because then people get defensive. The conversation doesn't move forward. But having those nuggets that kind of make people check themselves kind of help to get you out of the situation, but also help them to be more mindful of what they're saying to you.
Right. So at BWHI, we spend a lot of time talking about intersectionality.
Yes.
So Black women, brown women live at the intersection of many, but at least 3 oppressions of racism, gender discrimination, classism. Mm-hmm. How can we get allies, colleagues, employers, others to understand that, what's going on is more than racism, to actually, without having to, offer a dissertation, but we understand you want to be helpful, you're well-intended, but this is bigger than perhaps the way you all might be thinking about it.
Yeah, the concept of allyship has gained a lot of attention lately. And to be very honest, people are doing it wrong. The first thing I try to tell people that are, looking for allies or looking to be. So like both sides of that equation need some attention. Allyship is an action word. It is not a title. It's not a thing you call yourself. We've got a lot of people running around saying, I'm an ally, or, she's an ally for us. Let's be very careful about that. It is something you demonstrate in your behavior. And so with that in mind, as we are seeking out people that we think will be great allies, they're probably doing something. You want to pay attention to the people that are doing something. And so when you see that, those are the people that you want to bring into conversations. You want to invite to have more perspective. You want to potentially build relationships with, depending on your role and the objective at that point, so that you can say, okay, I've seen this person do. I've seen this person moving, because that's what allyship is about. It's doing something. And so we want to be really cautious about feeling like, oh, this person's a CEO or this person, we do need power players, but you need power players that are comfortable and willing to lean in. Now, I will also say this. Some people need some support and assistance, which is why I have a job. Honestly, I get to go in and teach people how they should show up so they can let people know, I want to be an ally. I want to be seen as a supporter. And so people are still learning. So I encourage all of us, Black people, especially right now, we don't have a lot of patience, and so it's like in the ways that we can, you got to remember, we've been woke for a while. We have an idea what's going on, what this feels like to be in this skin. But like a month ago, everybody woke up with a battery in their back and when they want to plan today, and so for them, it feels like, oh my God, I see the problem. Let's fix it now. And it's like, no, let me help you understand why you need to really get the depths of this problem so you know how to help. And those aren't conversations all of us can have. Thankfully, I get to lean in and have some of them, but in the ways that we can, like, if you're looking to identify an ally, go by action. If you're looking for somebody you'd like to be an ally, look for ways to invite them in so you can see if they're even open to being a supporter. This is not the time to still be convincing people that they should be participating.
Yeah. And it takes more than one conversation.
Yes. Yes, it takes several, and it takes you giving people a bit of grace. People have to give me grace. I work in inclusion and diversity. I still make mistakes. I still learn all the time. And so we have to still understand this is a learning space. Everybody's toes aren't on the line. Some people really want to be in the race and don't even know where to start at. And so we have to realize that as we're looking to build some of these relationships, it might not be you that can make that connection, but people do have to be willing to bring people along. So be willing, point people to the right resources, point people to people like me or other leaders in this space that can help to get this education going along so people know how they can show up and participate without putting the burden of that on their employees.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you.
Cabral Company, thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate your work and all that you're doing to help navigate this experience. Take care and be well, please. Now I want to bring in someone who's on the front lines of healthcare. Dr. Jennifer Lincoln is a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist at an OB hospital in Portland, Oregon. And as a physician, Dr. Lincoln has taken a somewhat unusual approach to health education, TikTok. She's released a number of videos, but a recent TikTok on racial bias in healthcare has gone viral, and people, perhaps some who never really thought about health disparities or the way Black people are treated by physicians, are paying attention. So, Dr. Lincoln, welcome to Black and Well TV. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, for people who haven't seen it, would you describe the TikTok video and why do you think it went viral?
Sure. Yeah, it was basically a TikTok just summarizing a study that was done in 2016. So this is not new information, that surveyed lay people and medical students and residents about their perception about Black people and pain. And they didn't just specifically say, do you think that Black people feel pain the same way as white people? But they asked biological questions that then if they held some of these beliefs, they were statistically more likely to underrate Black people's pain as well as undertreat them. So some things that are quite fantastical, like Black people have thicker skin or their blood clots sooner. And the more that they answered that where they believed them, then the more likely they were to undertreat. And what was interesting in this study is they interviewed lay people and then people with medical training. And in the group of people who had medical training, 50% of that group that was surveyed answered incorrectly to held one or more of those beliefs. And the more they held, the more likely they were to underrate pain. So it was a smaller study, but still entirely, in my opinion, valid. And as I've seen after so my posting was just explaining that. And then if you go in the comments of that, you can see there's definitely people have experienced this for sure. So, yeah.
So this is, obviously for most of us, pretty incredible. I mean, people go through medical school. There's a medical school curriculum. Mm-hmm. It doesn't teach that. Nope. It doesn't teach that Black people or brown people have thicker skin or don't feel pain. And yet 50% is a huge percentage of medically trained people who would have these beliefs. So this video and several of your videos have been seen by hundreds of thousands of people. Are you having different conversations with provider colleagues? Are they saying things to you? Have they said anything to you that's surprising? Mm-hmm. Are you even optimistic about what you're hearing from your colleagues or patients?
Yeah, so I would say the majority of the comments from colleagues and my peers are surprised at that study because, like you said, this is not something that we are actively taught in medical school. I mean, and I went to medical school in the South. I went to Tulane University in New Orleans, and there was never, a conversation about that. But there's formal education and there's informal education, right? And some people, not my colleagues, thankfully, but other people have said, well, you misrepresented this study and it's only a small group and you can't draw a huge number of data. But my response to that is go read the thousands of comments from Black people who have experienced exactly this. And they will tell you they didn't need this study and they didn't need me putting this out there for them to believe this. And then you can look at other studies that have also corroborated that even kids being treated with appendicitis, Black kids are undertreated and diagnosed late. So there's lots of other things that support this. So this was one small thing. And I would say with my colleagues, it's a lot of, we were never formally taught this, but we have certainly heard or seen that, or we've seen somebody else, right? Everybody's seen somebody else do it. And so I find that interesting. And Yeah, and a lot of people said, well, why did you put that out there? And I just thought it was interesting to cover, but I really think the reason that people watched it and took it seriously, Amber did a great discussion about the power dynamics, right? There's definitely power dynamic, me as a physician and as a white physician saying it. Why are people listening to that now? Again, and so many of the comments that I had were, yeah, we knew this. This is not new to us. Why are you just speaking about this now? And they're totally right. They're
Yeah.
absolutely right.
Yeah. So Portland has what, about 3% Black population, something like that.
We're pretty white, yeah.
Yeah. So have you seen this among Black patients in Portland? And I'm thinking, you're an OB hospitalist, and of course I don't have to talk to you about all that's been in the press recently about poor, terrible, horrendous, tragic Black maternal health experiences, and the fact that Black women report they're not listened to, their complaints, their pain not taken seriously.
Right.
So have you seen that in Portland? But what then would you say to other OBs and providers who are in this situation, who are treating or caring for Black women, particularly laboring moms or or postpartum moms, to help change this outcome?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I would say as an OB hospitalist, I work in one of the highest risk hospitals in the Portland metro area. And the benefit of that is that we are on the forefront when it comes to protocols and standardization, whereas unfortunately, the majority of women deliver in hospitals not with not with that many standards. And so we have protocols when it comes to hypertension and cardiovascular things. We take it very seriously, and we've been doing that for a long time. And that's important because we know that when it comes to this increased maternal morbidity and mortality that you're referring to, a lot of it is related to hypertensive disorders of pregnancy and postpartum. So we are very much on that, and I think that's a benefit of where I work. That said, I know that, and I mentioned this in I think in a follow-up to TikTok or an Instagram post, that I may, we can all as white people say, well, yeah, but I'm okay. I'm not biased. We all are to some degree. And as healthcare providers and as doctors and the ones in charge of labor and delivery, we have to check that bias. And that's important, whether you think that you are, you aren't, or you work at a hospital that you think treats Black women the same, and that's not our hospital. So I think it's important that we do that. And you're right. We don't have a lot of Black women in our city, so we don't have as many, in terms of our patients. And I think in my mind, when I am caring for one, I add that as a risk factor in my head. And I say, okay, keep that in mind. And then I do the check where I say, okay, I know how to manage labor. I know what I'm doing. I'm treating her blood pressures. Hey, if she was white, would I do the same thing? And that may seem really strange or, because we're supposed to treat everybody the same, but clearly something is there and there's a bias there, and it's up to us to address it. And it's much more comfortable if I just said, well, I'm not racist, because I'm fine. But you can't do that because we know that there's that bias no matter what.
And there's been a fair amount of research that looks at the experiences of racial discrimination, low birth weight babies, maternal mortality. You can go back to 92 with Arlene Geronimus, where she talked about weathering, and we know Black women have more cortisol in their bloodstream than white women. I don't know that medical school students are taught this, but what happens, how it gets expressed is you, patient, are not complying. You are not doing what should be done. So how can we work in to the curriculum, but also the practice? I'm thinking during the fellowship period and the idea of understanding the lived experiences of your patient and understanding social determinants, so that we talk about patient-centered care all the time, so that you actually have that patient-centered care, have a partnership with the patient instead of this power dynamic that exists.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's what Amber brought up, right? An ally is an action and not just a TikTok post and you run, but we need to see this change. And I know that there are some places where we're talking about cultural competencies and you have your 1 hour of diversity training and you talk about high risk groups for an hour and you move on, but this needs to change. In my medical school, again, we talked about it superficially, I'm sure. The fact that I don't really remember it tells you that it probably wasn't that ingrained. And so medical schools need to change this, residencies need to change this, and it's not just that 1 hour superficial training. We need to be made to feel uncomfortable. We need to be made to address, okay, why did you think that? I'm kind of catching up. And something people have said to me is, why are you doing this now? You should have been doing this years ago. And you're absolutely right. and I apologize. And I know that, it might seem like we're doing this now and it's trendy. It can't just be something that's cute and trends for 2 weeks and then it goes away. And so one way you can do that and not rely on your school or your program director to teach it to you is do the work yourself. Don't go to your Black friend and say, so can you teach me like what it's like to, it's not fair to put that on somebody. So read White Fragility, read Medical Apartheid, which I just started reading 2 days ago, and I'm only 50 pages in, and I'm like, why was I not told to read this as a medical student?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, we all, we hear about Tuskegee, and then you're like, well, that doesn't happen anymore, right? That was then, and here we are now. I think something I've learned so much from this movement is understanding why Black people are hesitant to seek out healthcare, and not just from other white providers, but even other Black providers, because it's the whole system. And I really, that's got to be a big part of our understanding, is that we're dealing with hundreds of years of being mistreated. So just because you did your 1 hour of diversity training and you're using the right words and whatever, well, now everybody should want to come to the hospital and see you. It's not like that. And so it's a continuous process, but it's something I heard, a phrase that I saw the other week was, racism was created by white people, so we're the ones who have to fix it. We can't rely on being taught, here's what you need to do. We have to do the work ourselves.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm talking about sort of what happens at the provider level, but what about the administrative level? I mean, what's the role of hospital administrators in this as well?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Sometimes I'm glad I'm not a hospital administrator, but you can't just send out the email that we're in support, and we stand by you and we are paying more attention. That's great, but it needs to be in. So let's look at the wage gap. Let's analyze how many Black physicians do you have on staff? We can tell you it's less because they only represent, I think, 5% maybe, or 6% of physicians in the yeah. What does your staff look like? And also, if you see something, where can you report it to? How easy is it? Is there negative? Is it receptive, or are you targeted then for speaking out? And if you're the ones who are only having the 1 hour diversity training when you show up, as a new employee, that's not enough. So what are you doing differently? So it's systemic change. It's systemic racism. It needs to be systemic change, and it needs to come from top down, and you have to have standards. Just like when I'm in an operating room and whatever happens in there at the end of the day, even though it's a whole team, it comes to me if something happens and I set the tone. Same thing has to happen in the hospital. So it's about action and putting your money where your mouth is.
So speaking of action, more than a couple, people have suggested that if there were standards, quality standards, outcome standards by race and ethnicity that were tied directly to reimbursement, that would do a world of good.
Sure.
So I know you're a hospital administrator, but as a physician, you would also be held accountable.
Yes.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And then people start to say, well, it's really tied to poverty and to this and to that. And well, no, we know that even when we control for that, and when you look at college educated Black women, they actually do worse. So it's not just that. I agree. And I just got an email from our labor and delivery unit just maybe 2 days ago that they're starting to now stratify things and adding that in. And then part of it's like, well, why haven't we done that before? But the other part of it is, okay, now we're doing it. Yeah, should we hold you accountable? Just like when we have certain rates of infection or readmissions, we might not get reimbursed. And that's a federal, top down, and we respond to that. So if we were to enact that, and that's where it comes into the voting and action and forcing people to be uncomfortable, it's a lot easier just to look away and say, well, it's because of X, Y, and Z. Well, no, it's not. Let's fix it.
Yeah. So one last question before I let you go. We've seen providers protesting all over the country. And I don't know if you've been out in any of the protests, but have you talked to any of your physician colleagues or any physicians who are protesting, and have they talked about why and what's motivating them?
Yeah, no, there is a local chapter of physician moms here who are getting together, and actually they might be down in Pioneer Square right now, the White Coats for Black Lives movement. And yes, and a lot of it is they're doing it because this is not new information, and we know that racism, healthcare disparities are at the crux of it. And so it's important not just to do your one Instagram post and move on, but it's actually to help hold people accountable. And again, we're in a power position. We're white, we're physicians. People tend to listen to us a bit more, which we can have discussions about that all day long, but you need to use it. You need to use that power.
Okay. What's your next video going to be?
My next TikTok video, I have about 10 that are made, but I don't. What do you want it to be about? Actually, my next
one
one
of these topics.
it's either about vaginas or about no. Actually, my next one is about. I've already filmed it. It's about making mistakes in racism and the fact that it's a lot easier to be quiet, but it's we're all going to make mistakes, and you just have to own it and still jump in anyway. So stay tuned.
All right. Well, Dr. Jennifer Lincoln, thank you for not being quiet.
Yeah.
OB hospitalist from Portland, Oregon, thank you very much, and
Oh,
good luck and be safe out in the protest.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So our last guest is Charles F. Coleman Jr., a civil rights attorney and activist from Brooklyn, New York. Proudly from Brooklyn. Charles is a political analyst who appears on CNN and Headline News, and he's the founder of CFC 40, a nonprofit that encourages new generations of activists and leaders within the Black community. And Charles is currently featured on the web series Black Brilliance 360, which airs on YouTube. And in the spirit of full transparency, happens to be the brother of our Chief Communications Officer, Monica Coleman. So thank you for sharing your sister with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Really, really glad to be on the program. I want to say that I truly do feel honored to be in this space because I respect the fact that this is a woman's space and that this is a space that is curated for women. But I do appreciate the fact that you all have created space for men to at least observe the conversation and in this case to participate. So I do not take that lightly, and I want to thank you for having the foresight and the vision to include a man's perspective and voice as part of this discussion. So thank you.
Well, thank you. So I want to start with the Supreme Court ruling. Obviously, you understand the ruling. We now have another ruling against workplace discrimination.
Right.
But as a former EEOC attorney and an expert in diversity and inclusion, how do you anticipate this changing the internal workplace practice?
So I think,
I just want to also ask, if you think sort of what the immediate next steps need to be, and will they be sufficient?
So I think that that's a great question. I am an EEOC alum, and so for me, this was a victory and a conversation that has been brewing for a very long time to get to this point. I think that what we now have to look at in terms of where we go from here is a question about the emphasis on what the actual outcomes are as opposed to the opportunity. So we have, for a very long time been focused on the importance of the equality of opportunity. But what we ultimately see with that sometimes is continued disparity, because at the end of the day, if all you are required to do is to create situations where the appearance of opportunity is the same, and there's not enough emphasis or accountability around what the actual outcomes are, that still leaves a significant amount of room for disparities to continue to take place. You can't legislate anti-bigotry. You can't legislate anti-racism. I mean, you can try, but you won't be able to eradicate that because it deals with mindsets. So I do think that there's a need for continued education, continued enlightenment around these issues in the workplace. But at the end of the day, from a structural place, from a structural remedy mindset, one of the things that we have to really begin to shift our focus on now is moving beyond the notion of the equality of opportunity and beginning to focus on the equality of outcomes. So what's the breakdown, or where's the breakdown occurring between what we intend to happen with respect to creating opportunities that are equal for everyone who's applying, and then ultimately ending up with outcomes that are reflective of what it is that we intended to do in the first place?
So how do we implement accountability standards at the corporate level? Because to your point, most would say, oh, yeah, there's no issue with opportunity.
Right.
I think we know that that's not true.
Right.
But okay, there's no issue, and yet we see what we see. So if you were to sort of advise Fortune 100 companies on accountability, what would you say?
Well, Amber kind of stole some of my thunder. You have two diversity and inclusion practitioners on the call. I'm one of them, Amber's the other one. And you know, in that practice, in that space, in the diversity and inclusion space, it's really about what are you setting as your measurables. You know, when I counsel clients professionally in that space, I like to talk to them about sort of diversity myths, right? So we have a number of corporations who use diversity and sort of skew the categories in a way that allows them to feed an echo chamber of blind spots that they sort of don't realize how much their companies aren't very diverse, especially as you begin to look toward the top and leadership. So those are the things that I want to ask. I don't necessarily want to see, and I think that this is sort of an accountability model that can be used across the board. Don't give me blanket numbers and statistics, right? What does your leadership look like? Not just that, anecdotally and qualitatively, what do your employers say about how they experience, your employees say about how they experience their workplace? Those things are very important. And those are the questions that have to be, number one, asked. And number two, there has to be an interest in the answers, because as an employer, you may not want the answers back. And if you don't want the answers back, you should really be thinking about that and saying to yourself, what am I afraid of hearing? And why am I afraid of hearing it? And what am I going to do about that? So wrestling with these questions is how you develop strong measurables for better accountability models in the workplace.
So it's interesting, you said you can't legislate anti-racism. I've talked to a lot of people who say, you know what, I'm not in the business of changing hearts and minds. I just want to change behavior. So be a racist, just leave it at the door. When you come to the office, behave a certain way, pick it up on your way out. So if we can't legislate it, which is part of what the Supreme Court ruling is supposed to do, what else can we do? Because I think trying to change hearts and minds just personally is probably not where I put my first dollar.
Sure.
I put it in policies and procedures.
I think at a minimum, what we can do is focus on creating safe space for marginalized communities. At the end of the day, right? That's the bare minimum. That's the starting point. What we can do is we can ensure that for the spaces that we are responsible for the places that we are going to be accountable for, where we have influence, where we have the ability to do such, we are going to do our best to make sure that this is a safe space for people who tend to be overlooked or otherwise marginalized, in a way that they can, to the fullest extent possible, come and experience workplace activities, a workplace that is free from microaggressions, that is free from privilege that ultimately silences you, that is free from the hallmarks of systemic racism and systemic oppression in ways that oftentimes compromise the workplace experience for those same peoples. So you're right. At the end of the day, I can't tell you what to think. I can try to create spaces that ultimately are conducive to learning and understanding. It's not necessarily the job, as Amber already talked about, of Black people to sort of make that comfortable for you. It is your job to invest and pay people for their work and reach out to competent, qualified diversity practitioners who are going to support the efforts in your workplace. That is an investment that you have to make. That's what being an ally is all about. I know Jennifer talked about the need to, actively be an ally, and Amber talked about that as well. That's what being an ally looks like. It's an actual investment from your organization into qualified and competent outside practitioners, not sort of let me see if I can siphon some additional work out of folks who are already here for the free. That's not what this is about, right? So ultimately, what you can do and what you should be doing is, what can I do to, at a minimum, create safe spaces that function equally, or that serve to function equally for all employees, so that they have as similar a work experience as possible.
Okay. So, we've all been through diversity and inclusion training, some of us lots of times. And it's been a thing for the last 15 or 20 years. I read recently that requests for diversity and inclusion training among the Fortune 500 have increased 800%.
As they should. They need to increase 1,600%.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you the same question I asked Amber. What advice do you have for the well-meaning, well-intended managers and leaders at companies who want to ask their Black employees for help or their brown employees for help?
The first thing that I would say is that you need to do some work. And I think Jennifer talked about this, at length. It is not their responsibility to sort of use them as a sounding board. Those folks are not there to be the spokespersons if they don't choose to. And I think that it's awkward and almost very presumptuous to sort of put Black folk in that position, primarily because there is a lot of emotional trauma that is associated with what it is that we are experiencing as a people, what we have experienced as a people throughout our history in America, but also when you categorize it particularly within the context of a global pandemic. So we are dealing with a number of different things on a multitude of levels. And so to sort of ask people, hey, tell me about your trauma, that is a very invasive sort of endeavor. And while it may be well-meaning, and it is important that you're not so afraid to make mistakes that you don't ask the question, I think that the better idea is be willing to, number one, do the work yourself up front. Don't try to use somebody else's experience as your own cheat sheet, right? Because those things are well documented if you really wanted to know, and you just have to actually go and commit yourself to actually doing the work. And number two, make the real investment. Like I said, it's not sufficient for you to sort of just try to siphon off the experiences of your employees. This is the time, quite frankly, when you have to go outside of your company and seek to engage professionals that are going to be able to speak competently and appropriately to your workforce and to your management and to your leadership and to your supervisors about these issues and give you the proper instruction about how to frame these conversations in a way that's non-offensive and culturally competent.
Right. So I want to shift a little bit. Our youth are participating in street level activism in a way that we haven't seen in 50 years.
Sure.
The protests against violent and unjust policing have touched all races and ethnicities that we've seen, urban, rural, suburban folks. Your organization, CFC 40, Communities for Change,
yes,
it's focused on youth activism. So how can people join a movement or become allies on an issue that maybe they haven't experienced or really haven't had to think about it very much, but it's in their face now and people are paying attention? And what's CGC 40 doing to help?
So in terms of your first question, the whole idea, the whole premise behind CFC 40 is we in our community already have many of the resources necessary in order to manage or troubleshoot a lot of the problems that we face. The question is, how are we using them and how are we choosing to engage them? We are a big believer in the idea of doing your part, everyone doing their part and leading where they are. The reason that I really began CFC 40 is because I wanted people to sort of stop waiting for some sort of savior, stop waiting for some other elected leader from some place that was in a faraway land, basically like the Wizard of Oz, some person behind the curtain to sort of pull the string, and voila, there was going to be change in your community. Why would you do that and give away all of your power when you're right inside your community? And I guarantee you there are already organizations, there are already organizers, there are already networks and coalitions that are doing the work that is going to affect the proper change in your community. And so what we tried to do was partner with other organizations throughout the country that were on the ground in different cities. And I tried to use sort of the platform that I have as an individual who does media and other things as a way of bringing awareness to the work that was already being done in communities through these partnerships, and encourage people, hey, get involved and get active where you are. So to answer your question, I would encourage people to just do a little bit of cursory research about what organizations are in your area that are doing the type of work that you're interested in. Because there are a number of ways that we can get involved in terms of how we improve our communities, a number of ways that are close to our wheelhouses, right? That we don't have to sort of step so far outside of our lane that we're not comfortable, but that still allow us to make a bigger impact exactly where we are. So I encourage people to just do a cursory search of what organizations already exist in your area. And if by chance there is not anything that's in your wheelhouse that you know, gravitate to in the social justice realm that you feel like speaks to you and what it is that you want to do, start your own. You can. Don't wait for somebody else to tell you what you can and cannot do. There are a number of different avenues. It's really not that hard. We just have to make the decision whether you are a member of a community, whether you consider yourself an ally who's adjacent to the community. You have to just make the decision to become active, to get involved, and to make that difference.
Right. So if there are problems in the community knows what they are. They know what the solutions are.
Correct.
So
I mean,
it's a matter of resources and partnerships then.
9 times out of 10, if you ask people what they need, they can tell you. They can tell you. It's really a matter of just folks not necessarily being comfortable having to build it themselves. They know what they need. It's just a matter of, do we have the resources at our fingertips that are available to build, you know, what we need, and can we build it? But they know if you ask them. And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems that, you know, I think we face. There's a misconception in some cultures that we don't know what we want, or we're not sure, or we need help. And languaging, especially in the diversity and inclusion space, is extremely important. We don't necessarily need help because that implies that there's a part of us that is helpless. That's not the case. What we need is support, right? Like, we need support. And there's a big difference, although it may seem synonymous, in terms of language and the power of languaging. There is a huge difference between needing help or being helped versus being supported. Being supported means we have the initiative and we're moving this on our own. We can just use a push by folks who are aligned with us in that direction.
So we have to leave it there. Charles F. Coleman, attorney, civil rights attorney and activist. Thank you. I said CGC before. I'm sorry, it's CFC 40. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, Amber Cabral of Cabral Company and Dr. Jennifer Lincoln, OB hospitalist from Portland, Oregon. And on behalf of the Black Women's Health Imperative, I want to thank you for joining us today. Join us next Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time when we'll talk about parenting during protests and COVID-19. And if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to visit our website, coronavirus.bwhi.org, which we've developed to provide information and resources just for you. So as has been mentioned, it's Juneteenth, the commemoration of the end of legalized slavery in the U.S. Slavery officially ended in 1865, some 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and legalized discrimination in the form of racial segregation, forced reproduction, policies that restrict access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and voter disenfranchisement technically ended 55 years ago after the Civil and Voting Rights Acts passed. Racial and gender discrimination continue. What white supremacists wanted to accomplish more than anything else during and after Jim Crow was the separation of the races, to literally keep Black and brown people in their places. Racial disparities in income, wealth, and health are greater now than in 1972. Redlining and gerrymandering have preserved the current power structure, particularly in the South. We are more racially segregated now than in 1968. And the renowned Harvard researcher, Dr. David Williams, has found that if racial segregation ended, so would disparities in health outcomes. So here we are, some 155 years later, trying to overcome some of the same obstacles. Now, with the possibility of having COVID-19 actually used as a weapon against Black and brown people to prevent employment or limit employment. Those most at risk for and infected by this coronavirus are likely to live in densely populated dwellings, such as multi-floor apartment buildings, multi-generational households, where isolation is impossible sometimes, and to rely on public transportation, buses and subways. They are more likely to face an often unmasked and angry public, as one woman did in a video recently that went viral. An unmasked man tried to enter her store where she worked, and she pointed to the sign that said masks are required. He proceeded to berate her. He refused to leave and then complained that there was a Black Lives Matter sign in the window. All of this when we know masks reduce the transmission of the virus by at least 60%. COVID-19 and the protests of brutal policing are putting in very stark relief the lived experiences of the Black and Brown population. Despite the fact that while some progress has been made, many Black and Brown people are still where their parents and grandparents were. Today's New York Times feature story was a stunning article that showed the Black-white gaps in college attainment, household income, home ownership, incarceration, and life expectancy have not changed for 55 years. 55 years after discrimination became illegal. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.